Hey folks, Zach Osterman here, Insider Indianapolis Star, Sunday, October 1st. And this is, I guess you'd call it a reaction special, an unplanned video, obviously. Indiana moves on from Walt Bell, fires Walt Bell, terminates Walt Bell, whatever term you want to use. Walt Bell isn't Indiana's offensive coordinator anymore. Rod Carey will replace him. Carey, who Indiana fans will remember, was elevated in an interim role to replace Darren Hiller last season when Hiller was let go as offensive line coach. This time, and we'll get into this in a minute, Carey will not be interim. He's just the full offensive coordinator. Again, talk about that more in a second because I think it throws up a few interesting questions that I suspect will be answered in the coming days. But first of all, sorry, this took a couple hours. I was in transit home from Maryland, where Indiana lost yesterday afternoon, 44-17. And really, I think, it's always difficult for coaches, for head coaches, at least in my experience, to let go people on their staff. Everybody knows it's a business, but everybody also sort of understands the personal side of it. And most coaches have been terminated at some point or another, or maybe the staff they're on got let go. Obviously, of course, they will know people who've been terminated. It's never an easy conversation, but I think you can understand how Tom Allen got to this point with Walt Bell. Ultimately, a season and a half, effectively 17 games as offensive coordinator, and Indiana just never really found anything. There was never really any consistent threat. I think Indiana only broke 30 points with Bell as offensive coordinator, I want to say 3 or 4 times, and I think only 2 of those were in Big Ten play. Indiana had scored 5 touchdowns this season against 4 FBS opponents to this point in the year, none against Ohio State, 1 against Akron, 2 against Louisville, and 2 yesterday against Maryland. And without wanting to take anything away from Brendan Sorsby, because he looked good in those 2 drives, those were very much in garbage time once Maryland had kind of put the game to bed. They're really, I think, even more fundamentally than that, it just felt like Indiana never really could settle on an identity with Bell as offensive play caller. He came with a lot of air raid credentials, and Indiana certainly threw the ball a lot last season to, limited effect, kind of shifted to some more option principles when Dexter Williams became quarterback at the end of the season. But obviously, really didn't sustain that beyond kind of the Ohio State game this year. Williams still isn't healthy enough to play, and Indiana kind of pivoted back to Sorsby and Taven Jackson, 2 quarterbacks that I think it's probably fair to say are more comfortable throwing the ball in a lot of ways, although I think in different ways. They both can hurt you with their legs and they can have a mobility aspect to their game, but still there was just, it felt like Indiana never found a way to stack play calling in a way that sort of, strung out into these patterns that you could say, this is what Indiana's trying to do. This is how Indiana sort of gets from point A to point B to point C in its offensive game plan consistently. There was very little consistency. And Tom Allen said after Saturday night's game that he felt that, in real time, he saw a lot of good things from Indiana in terms of structure and in terms of sort of play calling and adjustments, and that he felt like just things weren't getting executed. But obviously something will have maybe changed a little bit in his estimation when he went back and watched film of Sunday's game. I think he's been pulling some pretty early mornings, some pretty early Sundays lately, trying to dig into some of the film of these games that Indiana's just not pulling together, quite frankly. And again, I think a lot's been made today of that the fan that stood up at the Tom Allen's coaches show last week and said, it's a business, and we respect you as a person and your staff, and we're just frustrated with play calling, particularly offensively. But I think even before that, you could just see the patterns that were emerging, the trends that were emerging just weren't working. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it was all Walt Bell's fault. I said this after Nick Sheridan was let go in 2021. It's never any one person's fault. It really isn't. There will be players who will take responsibility for it. Assistants will feel some responsibility for it. Allen will feel some responsibility for it. Probably Walt Bell will feel some responsibility for it. And so you never really, it's rare that it is something that is sort of like personally, offensive or, something that makes anyone within a program personally angry. But it just in terms of statistics, it just wasn't working. Indiana had, I think, broken 20 points in Big Ten games 4 times in 11 games under Bell. And if you looked at, a lot of their standard numbers, scoring offense, passing offense, total offense, they were consistently below the median or substantially worse than that in the Big Ten. They have the second worst scoring offense in the Big Ten through 5 games this season. And, without wanting to go too deep into it, the advanced numbers, EPA and stuff like that don't really look any better. In some cases, they look worse. Indiana will pivot to Rod Carey. This was kind of the time it had to happen. If Tom Allen was going to do it, because you've got the bye week here, and so you've got 2 full weeks for Rod Carey to kind of get his arms around what he's got and maybe what he thinks he's going to be capable of doing. It's worth saying that Carey actually has been a defensive analyst for Indiana when he's not been not counting the time he spent in the interim offensive line position last year. He's basically been bringing like an offensive perspective to defensive meetings. So he's going to have to kind of basically flip 2 switches and go back to being more of an offensive coach, just like day to day. I think the advantage, as much as anything else, in bringing Carey in is he knows your personnel. You're not bringing in somebody, and even if you, for example, wanted to consider elevating Anthony Tucker, Carey's been around a year longer than Anthony Tucker has. Anthony Tucker's Indiana's wide receivers coach, his co-offensive coordinator. Truthfully, the only other offensive staff members that have been around as long as Carey in Bloomington with this group, with this team, are Kevin Wright and Craig Johnson, the tight ends coach and the running backs coach. So you are at least bringing in somebody who knows your personnel, who probably will be able to sort of walk in already with some ideas about, we can try to do this, we can shift toward this. Obviously his Temple teams really struggled when he was head coach there. His Northern Illinois teams were much better. I think only once in like a 6-year period did they not finish top 40 in the country in yards per game. In particular, they were very good rushing the football and very creative rushing the football in terms of getting the quarterback involved, in terms of, trades and motions, in terms of, just kind of being able to run, but in a way that was still more sort of modern in terms of its structure and its scheme. And we'll see if he can replicate some of that. Obviously, you wouldn't expect miracles. I mean, he said that to us last year when he was elevated to interim O-line coach. And it's going to be even more difficult for him now. But at very least, that's kind of the stuff that you can trace his background in is 5 bowls, I think, in 6 years at Northern Illinois, 52 wins. Or maybe it was 4 bowls in 5 years and 52 wins. I'm struggling to remember as head coach. But some offenses that were very, very good running the football and just very good at the MAC level at being efficient, staying on schedule, staying in good down and distance situations. And that's what, if you're Indiana, obviously, if you can even kind of get some of that consistently in the near future, that alone would be a big boost. Again, it felt like it had to happen during the bye week because it gives Carey more time to work with his players. It will probably be a slightly unconventional bye week, I suspect. I think we'll hear from Carey at some point this week. It'll be interesting, because normally you would use this time to rest guys, and I'm sure Indiana won't overwork, they're more experienced players. The players have played a lot of snaps here in the first 5 weeks, but on the other hand, it may not be, sort of the normal, just kind of like shut a whole bunch of veterans down, let younger guys who are redshirting, guys who haven't played a lot, get a ton of reps during the bye week while coaches cycle in and out. I think it's going to be a slightly unconventional bye week in that regard. The other piece of this that I think has people curious, and it has me curious too, is the fact that Indiana is just making Carey the full offensive line coach. There's no interim tag attached. Now, my understanding is contractual details have not been ironed out yet, and it'll be interesting, of course, to see what those say. Typically Indiana has handed out 2-year contracts to its assistants with essentially just sort of like not an auto renewal, because, for example, a lot of Indiana's assistants' contracts were renewed after 1 year last year, and Walt Bell's wasn't. So, like, Walt Bell was actually trending toward basically his contract expiring at the end of December anyway. Very quick note there, Indiana will owe him, I believe, if I did my math right, about $175,000 in severance. That's basically just the rest of his guaranteed compensation, just the stuff that he would have been paid basically through the end of his contract. So they won't owe him any more or any less than they would have owed him just keeping him on staff until his contract ran out on December 31st. But what will be interesting to me is to see what kind of terms Indiana comes to with Rod Carey in terms of, does he get that 2-year deal? Is it will have to be structured somewhat differently in terms of sort of the space of time that it advances through, because you're hiring in mid-season. But it'll just be interesting, for a coach with some good offensive background, but also a coach who hasn't been an offensive coordinator specifically, I think, in more than a decade now. Um, just what does that look like? It'll be interesting to see, and I think it will tell us a lot about Tom Allen's faith and belief in Rod Carey as kind of the solution for his offense. Because frankly, if you're a head coach, that at a certain point, if you keep moving coordinators on, at some point that wheel is just going to keep turning around back until it gets to you. And this is Tom Allen's fourth coordinator change. Mike DeBoer retired. Kalen DeBoer obviously went to the Fresno State, took the head job at Fresno State, and then Indiana had to, sort of terminate, or again, whatever phrase you want to use, whatever word you want to use, both Nick Sheridan and Walt Bell. So, it's at some point you got to start sort of finding some solutions. If you're Tom Allen, and Rod Carey is the man he's going to entrust to figure those out. So we'll have more on this Mike Nislak and I podcast tonight. And we'll talk probably a lot more about this than we will about the Maryland game, to be honest. And then I do think at some point Indiana will put Rod Carey and possibly Tom Allen as well. It's also hard during the bye week because the head coach needs to go out and recruit some. The bye week is typically a period for recruiting, a big week for recruiting in terms of, getting your head coach and sometimes your assistants out on the road and in some high schools and different things like that, checking on commits, things like that. So I don't know exactly where Tom Allen will be, kind of in and out of the office this week, but I suspect we will hear at least from Rod Carey, if not both Carey and Allen, at some point this week, and we'll have more from that. But for now, we'll leave it there. Again, Walt Bell let go as Indiana's offensive coordinator. Rod Carey replaces him. The Hoosiers have 7 games left. They're 2-3. They're 0-2 in Big Ten play, and it's fair to say Carey's got his work cut out for him. Thank you for watching, and we'll talk to you soon.